The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from her bones and the sound from her throat, leaving only a raw, scouring silence in its wake. Elara drove the spade into the unyielding earth one more time, the shock of it vibrating up her arms, a dull ache that had become as constant as her own breathing. The prairie stretched out in every direction, an ocean of dying grass under a bruised pewter sky, and her husband's grave was a pitiful island in its midst, a fresh mound of dirt, dark and damp, that marked the end of a dream she had never truly believed in. Thomas had seen poetry in this emptiness. She saw only a vast, indifferent canvas for their failure. She was alone. The finality of the thought was a physical weight, pressing down on her, heavier than the sod she had piled for the walls of their half-finished house. He had died quickly, a fever that burned through him with the speed of a prairie fire, leaving her with nothing but a half-built shelter, a dwindling sack of flour, and the crushing knowledge of her own inadequacy. She was a woman of watered silk and parlor manners, not of calloused hands and grim survival. The air was sharp with the coming of winter, a clean, cold scent that carried no comfort, only a warning. Fear was a bitter taste at the back of her tongue, a constant companion that whispered to her in the long, terrifying nights. Her gaze fell upon the horizon, a perfectly straight line where the endless earth met the endless sky. A speck appeared there. It grew slowly, resolving itself from a blur into the distinct shape of a man on horseback. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was defenseless, a solitary woman miles from any settlement, a fact that had felt like a tragedy but now felt like a mortal danger. She froze, her hands still gripping the rough wood of the spade, her knuckles white. The rider did not approach with haste. His pace was measured, deliberate, as if he were a part of the landscape itself, a feature of its patient, predatory nature. As he drew closer, she saw he was a man weathered by the sun and the wind into something as hard as the land itself. His face was all angles and shadows under the brim of a stained hat, his clothes worn and practical. He pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance from her, the animal stamping and blowing steam into the frigid air. He did not speak. His eyes, a pale, startling gray, took in the scene with an unnerving stillness. The fresh grave, the unfinished soddy with its gaping holes for a door and window, and her, standing small and defiant beside her husband's final resting place. She expected a question, a platitude, an offer of hollow comfort. He gave her none. He simply sat on his horse, a silent, imposing sentinel, and his gaze was not one of pity, but of assessment. It was worse. Pity she could dismiss. This quiet, knowing appraisal stripped her bare, laying her vulnerability open to the cold prairie wind. Days bled into one another, each a struggle for warmth and sustenance. The stranger did not leave. He made a small, spare camp in a shallow coulee a quarter-mile from her soddy, close enough to be a constant presence on the edge of her awareness, yet far enough to grant her a semblance of privacy. He never approached her home. He never spoke to her. Yet his existence began to weave itself into the fabric of her solitary life. One morning, a skinned rabbit lay on the flat stone that served as her doorstep. Another day, she woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe and found a neat pile of cottonwood logs, more than she could have chopped in a week. He moved with a quiet economy, a competence that was as natural to him as breathing. He was a force of nature, much like the wind and the coming snow, but one that seemed inexplicably to be working in her favor. She watched him from the dark opening of her shelter. She watched him mend a broken section of the fence Thomas had started, his movements sure and strong. She watched him sit by his small fire at dusk, a lonely silhouette against the deep violet twilight, and she wondered. Her initial fear had not vanished, but it had been joined by a reluctant curiosity. Who was this man? What did he want? Every cautionary tale she had ever heard warned her against men like him, drifters, outlaws, men with no pasts who preyed on the weak. Yet his actions offered a stark contradiction. He asked for nothing. He took nothing. He simply was. One evening, after stewing the last of her salted pork with wild onions, she ladled a portion into a tin bowl. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked across the crackling grass toward his camp. The wind whipped her skirts around her legs and tore at her hair. He saw her coming but did not rise. He remained by his fire, his hands resting on his knees, watching her approach with that same unnerving stillness. She stopped at the edge of the firelight, the space between them charged with a tension she could not name. She held out the bowl. "For the wood," she said, her voice a thin, reedy thing, nearly lost to the wind. He looked from the bowl to her face, his pale eyes searching hers in the flickering light. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod and took the bowl from her trembling hands. It was the entirety of their exchange, but it felt as momentous as a signed treaty. She retreated to her own cold home. The image of his large, calloused hand closing around the tin bowl burned into her mind. It was the beginning of their language, a silent conversation spoken in gestures of shared survival. The arrival of Mr. Croft was an intrusion of a different sort. He came not with the quiet watchfulness of the stranger, but with the loud, oily confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. He rode a fat, glossy horse and was flanked by two hired men whose eyes were as dull and empty as spent cartridges. Croft dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth as if trying to claim it with his very weight. He removed his hat, revealing a bald, sweating head, and gave her a smile that did not reach his predatory eyes. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice a rich baritone that sounded obscene in the clean, cold air. "A tragedy, your husband's passing. A terrible tragedy." He glanced at the unfinished soddy with open disdain. "This is no life for a lady. Certainly no place for a grieving widow to be all alone." Alara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She stood in the doorway of her home, the rough-hewn frame at her back the only solid thing in a world that was tilting. "I am managing, Mr. Croft." The words felt frail, but she forced them out. Croft's smile widened. Of course, but the land requires work. Proving a claim is a man's business. The law is quite clear on the matter." He gestured vaguely at the endless prairie. "I am prepared to offer you a fair price for your husband's efforts. Enough to see you back to the city, back to civilization where you belong." The offer was an insult wrapped in condescension, the threat hanging unspoken in the air between them. He saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle, a weak thing to be brushed aside. A cold fury, unfamiliar and potent, began to smolder in her chest, burning away the last vestiges of the frightened woman she had been. "This is my home," she said, her voice low and steady. "It is not for sale." Croft's affable mask slipped. His face hardened. "Don't be a fool, woman. You can't hold this claim. I will have it, one way or another." One of his men took a step forward, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. The world seemed to shrink, the vast sky pressing down. And then a new sound, the soft, deliberate click of a rifle being cocked. All three men froze. Alara's gaze snapped toward the coulee. The stranger was there. He stood at the rise, not hidden but in plain sight, a long rifle held loosely in his hands. He hadn't run. He hadn't shouted. He was simply present, a figure of absolute, lethal stillness. His pale eyes were fixed on Croft, and in them was a cold promise that turned the speculator's bluster to ash. Croft swallowed, his bravado evaporating under that silent, unwavering gaze. "You should leave," the stranger said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that carried across the distance with chilling authority. Croft stared at him, then at his men, who looked suddenly uncertain. He saw a man who was not playing at threats, a man who was as much a part of this harsh land as the winter frost. Sputtering about lawyers and the county sheriff, Croft heaved himself back onto his horse. With one last venomous glare at Alara, he and his men rode away, their retreat a stark admission of defeat. The dust settled. The prairie was quiet again, the silence profound after the ugly intrusion. Alara stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her weak-kneed and breathless. The stranger, Silas. She had heard Croft's man mutter the name, remained on the rise for a long moment before slowly lowering the rifle. He walked toward her, his stride unhurried, his presence no longer unsettling but a profound, undeniable comfort. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze finally leaving the horizon to meet hers. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet gravity. "Thank you," she breathed, the words feeling utterly inadequate. He gave a single, sharp nod, the brim of his hat dipping low. The gesture was enough. That evening, when she carried his meal to his camp, she did not retreat. She sat on a smooth stone on the other side of his fire, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The silence between them was different now, stripped of suspicion and filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the vast, star-dusted darkness. They were two small points of light in an overwhelming emptiness, but for the first time, she did not feel alone in it. She felt anchored. The firelight carved shadows and warmth into the small space they shared against the immense night. He was cleaning his rifle, the oiled rag moving over the dark steel with a practiced rhythmic grace. She watched his hands, large, scarred, yet surprisingly deft. They were hands that could mend a fence, chop wood, and hold a weapon with deadly purpose. And they were the hands that had taken the bowl of stew from her. In the flickering glow, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften. She saw past the stoic protector and glimpsed the man beneath, a man who carried his own solitude like a shield. A strange, reckless vulnerability bloomed inside her, a desire to offer something of herself in return for the safety he had given her. The truth rose to her lips, a confession she had never uttered to a living soul, not even to Thomas. "I've never been kissed," she whispered. The words were barely a sound, nearly stolen by the wind, but he heard them. His hands stilled. He slowly set the rifle aside and looked at her, truly looked at her, his pale eyes holding an expression of profound, aching gentleness she had never seen before. Her admission hung in the air between them, a fragile, trembling thing. It was the story of her life, of a polite, passionless marriage arranged for convenience, of a quiet existence where her own heart had been a locked room. He reached up and slowly, deliberately, took off his hat, holding it in his lap. The gesture was one of reverence, of respect. It stripped away the last of his formidable armor, leaving him open and vulnerable before her. The firelight played across his dark hair and the weathered lines of his face. "Let's start gentle," he promised, his voice a low, rough murmur. It was not just a promise about a kiss. It was a promise of a new beginning, a vow to handle her fragile, unopened heart with care. It was a promise to build something here, on this unforgiving land, not out of grim necessity, but with a tenderness she had never known. He made no move to cross the fire, no move to touch her. He simply sat there, his gaze holding hers, and in that shared look, a foundation was laid, stronger than sod and surer than any fence. The vast, lonely prairie still stretched out around them, but it no longer felt like an ending, felt like a beginning.